I'm now speaking with Derek Pillie, candidate for City Clerk, City of Fort Wayne. Derek, when did your political appetite first begin, first get whetting? How did you first get into the political game here?
Well, originally I went to college to study journalism. I went to the George Washington University in Washington, D.C. and studied journalism there, and was expected to, go to get a job with a newspaper or something like that and cover politics and cover other public events. And this would have been in the late 90s when I was there, and you could already kind of get a feel for the sense that the journalism industry was changing, and they were moving away from hard news to more softer kind of opinion journalism than hard journalism, which is what I was interested in. So while I was in school, I had started out interning for congressman from where I grew up, outside of Philadelphia, and I was working on the Hill one day a week, and I enjoyed working in that, so I switched majors from journalism to political science, and internship turned into a part-time job, and that turned into a full-time job, and I wound up working in Washington, D.C. on Capitol Hill for about 4 years, and then moved to Indiana when I got married and worked out here for the local congressman for 10 years.
So, how is Washington, D.C. politics and the political environment different from a place like Fort Wayne?
It's funny because you think that, we all read about the stories on television and in the newspapers about all the political games that are going on. But the reality is a lot of the stuff that happens in Washington, D.C. that takes place within the government isn't terribly partisan. It's just the stuff that is partisan is what grabs all the headlines and gets our attention, and it's what people, like to argue about and everything like that. So from my standpoint, I was a relatively junior staffer working on policy issues and stuff like that, and I worked with Republicans and Democrats and whoever, and we got, I actually, in the short time I was out there, 2 bills that I worked on actually got signed into law. And they weren't necessarily terribly controversial things or anything like that, but it's because a lot of the stuff that takes place, especially back then, it's gotten a lot more heated and frustrating since then. But even, there's a lot of fighting that takes place, but most people aren't involved in that. Most people out there, I would say, I shouldn't say most people because I don't really know, but I would say a lot of the people that I worked with were interested in, trying to help the person they worked for do the best job they could for their constituents. That's why, that's why I was out there. That's why I enjoyed working both when I was in Washington, D.C., and then when I come out here, all the political activity, all that stuff is much closer to the surface because it's local politics and everybody's kind of involved in it. So we're in Washington, D.C., where you would think things are a lot more political. I actually did a lot less politics out there than when I moved out here, and you're a part of the community and you're involved, and everything that you do touches on, the government, whether it's the city government or the county government or the state or something like that. You're constantly running into it. So it's different in the sense that a lot of the political activity that takes place in Washington, D.C. isn't quite as dramatic as it's made out to be in the media. On the other hand, you get a lot more of that drama when you get involved in local government because everybody's got a stronger interest in things.
You mentioned hard news and soft news, and that you were around as that was changing. Go into a little more detail with that, please.
Sure. It's been frustrating for me because I see a lot of my friends who did decide to stick it out with journalism. A lot of them are either not in journalism now or they're trying to find jobs, somewhere else. A lot of the harder news positions got eliminated. You can see it even locally. It's a movement, I guess, that's still taking place. Not so much in Fort Wayne. We're really blessed actually in Fort Wayne. People don't realize it, to have 2 independent newspapers to some degree, because most cities that have 2 newspapers, they're actually, they're owned by the same company, and we have that a little bit here, but they're very different voices. You have to go to really large cities to get that nowadays. So we're a little fortunate here, but if you look at like what happened in Indianapolis, where a lot of the hard news staff got cut from the Indianapolis Star, and they're focused on finding people who are going to write content that's going to go viral and get shared by lots of people and make money for them. I mean, they're a business, so they're trying to make money, but it's a very different style of journalism. It's a very different style of writing, and it doesn't necessarily serve the community's interest as well, in my opinion, because instead of putting more of an effort forward, investing more resources in covering what's taking place in the community, they're investing more resources in what's going to entertain the community. And that's, as an organization, you have to make the decision what's more important. I just wish they prioritize the other more a little bit.
But you being on the inside, seeing what's happening, it's much different than the guy sitting at home who just watches TV and he's receiving this stuff as fact and real news. So I don't want to say that is part of the dumbing down of America, but so rather than like you said, focusing on hard, serious news, it's all entertainment.
Right. I mean, I think it's a resource challenge, first and foremost. It's like any business or any family has to deal with, really. It's like, I'm sure everybody would love to take their kids to Disney World, and everybody would love to eat out at their favorite restaurant every night. And the reality is you can't do that because you've got limited resources. You have to figure out what you're going to do with them. Businesses and media organizations have the same challenge. They have to figure out how to, in a lot of cases, do more with less nowadays. I think locally, like I said, between the print journalism and broadcast journalism, they actually, make a pretty good effort in spite of the relative size of our area. We're not the biggest media market in the country. We're not even in the top 100 media markets. But we get really talented people that stay with us for a bit before they move on to bigger and better things. And the folks that are here, they make an impact. There was a really good story I was watching on, I think it was Indiana's News Center. They actually went through and tried to actually explain what was going on with the water. For those who are watching this later, we had really bad tasting water for a while here. And the city kept telling everybody, no, the water's safe. And everybody's like, yeah, but it smells really bad and it doesn't taste very good. And nobody was really bridging the gap. And the media actually went out and tried to, okay, here's what's going on. This is what's happening. And that's really the important role media plays. So it's not that they've totally switched away from it. It's just that I think it's harder for them to do that because they have less resources to do it. And they're under a lot of pressure to produce content that's going to be shared and distributed. And lots of people are going to read and access. And unfortunately, as Americans, we're more attuned to that entertainment type reporting than we are to the hard news type stuff.
So how are you taking all that experience and putting it together to run for city clerk?
Sure. Well, I think the biggest challenge with city clerk's job is that the clerk's really responsible for being that connection between the citizens of the city and what's happening with their city government, particularly as it relates to city council and how engaged they are with the city council. So, my background being a little bit in legislative politics, working for Congress, and a little bit in technology and marketing communications, which is what I've been doing for the last 4 years in the private sector. I can take those experiences and, work on ways to make sure we're doing a better job connecting with citizens. Because one of the biggest frustrations I have as someone who's worked in government is you see survey after survey. They were just talking about one on the radio the other day where confidence in Congress is at an all-time low. I think it's like at 6% or something crazy like that. And we're seeing that across the board in government, that people, there's a difference between trusting your government and having confidence in your government to do its job. I don't think anybody should totally trust their government. That's the job of the citizens, is to question their government. That's what the process is all about. But in that questioning, they have to have confidence that the government's actually going to do their job. And I think what we're seeing is an erosion in that confidence of the people. People don't believe government's actually going to be able to follow through. With Congress, they haven't been able to pass appropriations bills that actually fund the government in any sort of regular fashion in over a decade now. I mean, that's their main job, is to pass the budget, essentially. And they don't seem to be able to do it. Locally, I don't think we're seeing that yet. But we're at a point in Fort Wayne where there's a lot of energy and excitement about what's happening in our city. There's also problems and challenges that parts of our city are facing. And I don't necessarily think the folks who are excited about what can happen with our city and the folks who are frustrated with what's going on in our city are really connected. So we've got a really big community, but we've got, I don't want to say divisions, because they're not really divided against each other. They just have different focuses. And I think what the city clerk can do through their position is help the folks who feel disconnected from what's going on be engaged, know when to pay attention, know when to be involved, and remove those barriers that stand in their way from being a participant in the government. And then for everybody else who's excited about what's happening with city government, not to feel like they got left out when the decisions are being made as far as what we're doing as a community to move forward, so that 5, 10, 15 years down the road, they're not sitting there complaining, oh, I remember when we had a chance to do something and we didn't do anything about it, but I didn't feel like I was a part of the process. Nobody should feel like they're disenfranchised or don't have a voice within the government. I think that, to me, is what excites me about public service. It's why I love to solve problems. I love to engage people and figure out how to help them do what they want to do. And that's really what the clerk's job is all about.
Were your parents like that?
My dad probably...
Activist type, I mean?
My mom, not so much. She worked in childcare, and she's more of like a parenting counselor, parent advocate type social service roles. My father was electronics. Well, he's had a lot of different careers because, whatever career he's gotten into, then they downsize and he has to kind of reinvent himself. So he's been, he's a Navy man, he was a sonarman in the Navy, then he was an electrical engineer, then he was a technical writer, then he was a systems administrator. Then he went to work for the Census Bureau for a while, so he's had all sorts of different jobs. But one of the things my passion for understanding what's going on in the community really came from him. In fact, I think I got started in journalism because he always insisted on having the paper at home, and I read like anything I could get my hands on, so I was always reading the local paper. He would take me to school board meetings occasionally, and I started reporting on school board for my school paper. That's how I started writing for the school paper. Talking about things like when we were consolidating schools or building new schools and where we were building them and things like that. We were in an area that was growing at the time, so there was a lot of that going on. And trying to figure out how to take what's happening with the school board and explain it to high school students, my peers, and explain how it relates to them when they really don't have a say in anything. They didn't have a vote or anything like that at that point, except for some of the seniors. But trying to help them make that connection. That's what that's where I kind of got my roots in journalism and where I had a passion for that hard news thing. I got to intern with our local paper. I got to cover all sorts of random things that would happen in the 1 hour of time I had at the newspaper office with him during the school day. It just seemed like random things would happen, like live events at the school where we'd go out, and this was before cell phones or anything like that. So he'd go cover something, and then I'd go man the payphone so I could put the quarters in and call his reports back into the office while he was trying to get interviews done and everything like that. It's a very different time than it is now. But that's really where that comes from. Probably my father's activism and my mom's compassion. You kind of blend them together, and that's how I got where I am.
Now, one of the things that we're trying to accomplish with turning this into a documentary is to attract younger people, students. Mm-hmm. And I've always felt that by attending forums, a younger student can kind of have their eyes opened a little bit. How can you better articulate the benefits of a student watching a political forum and sitting there in person ready to ask questions?
Well, I think that it's the best way to find out if there's going to be something that interests you. I mean, the challenge, I think, for young people a lot of times is they don't really understand how what happens in government relates to them in their daily life. And it's not just limited to young people. Adults have the same challenge. I've lost track of the number of conversations I've had with peers, adults in their 30s, 40s, and going into their 50s who don't vote anymore and don't see any reason why they should be voting. And so I don't know that it's necessarily limited to young people, but young people have a great opportunity because they have passion, they have excitement, and they, generally speaking, have less responsibilities at home than older people do. So they can go out and set the world on fire and not worry about having to, be home to fix dinner on time and help the kids with their homework and stuff like that. And so that's where a lot of great activism comes from. I'm really excited that I've got two junior high school age kids that are helping out, volunteering on the campaign. They wanted to learn more about politics, so I said, well, help out on a campaign. It's the best way to learn. So the best thing you can do is engage them, whether it's through a forum or whether it's just listening to politicians talk on different topics, whether it's in a forum setting or whether it's, this sounds silly, but like speeches on C-SPAN or something like that. The critical thing is it's got to be something that's going to engage them, because we all have different passions, we all have different things that excite us, that drive us, and not everyone is just going to be generally passionate about everything about government. People just don't have that. But there's always going to be, whether it's water issues and what we're dealing with the combined sewer overflows and how that's working out, whether it's what hits a lot of people is crime issues in their community. I mean, because that's a very personal experience when it does happen in your backyard. I know in our neighborhood, even when we have stores that are robbed and things like that, then everybody starts paying attention to it. They don't mind it when it's not happening, but then when something happens, then everybody sits up and tries to figure out what's going on. Parks and how we deal with open space. There's a lot of issues that affect young people, and probably the biggest issue that could affect them that they're just not aware of is finance, and how the city spends its money and how the city finances how it's spending its money. Because long term, when a city takes on too much debt or takes on a lot of debt, then that can come back and hurt. The people that are going to be paying for it aren't the people that are making the decisions. It's people coming after us that wind up making the decisions. And so it's good for them to get ahead of that and make sure that they're engaged in the process and hold people accountable. And that's the challenge there, is how do you get young people to feel that and understand that. I don't know. If I had the answer to that, I wouldn't be sitting here talking to you. I'd probably be making lots of money on some national campaign talking to them about it.
No, that is the answer right there, though. Where they can listen to you and your process of maturation through this process, because they don't have a roadmap. They're just put out here someplace, and there's no direction. They have no stories to tie into,
right? And
that's what I'm going to be using these stories for. But what do you say to a person who says that their vote doesn't matter and they don't vote?
Well, it's tough, because it's like with anything else, whether you're talking about voting in politics or whether you're talking about, from a religious context, if you're talking about evangelization, or if you're just trying to persuade somebody to agree with you on something. If they're determined to not agree with you, you're not going to be able to convince them their vote matters if they're determined that it doesn't. The key thing is, again, to talk to people, find out what it is that drives them. It's always better to be a listener than a talker. And a lot of times in politics, people like to talk a lot and not necessarily listen. And the challenge that you have with that is that if you're talking all the time, you can't hear what the other person's trying to say. And if you can't hear what they're trying to say, then there's no way you can actually serve them. And that's what being involved in this is all about. It's serving the people that elect you, that you're responsible. Not just that elect you, but all the people that you're responsible for. So I think the first challenge there is trying to find that thing that drives them, the thing that they're interested in, or the thing that gets them upset, and then putting that in context for them so they can understand how their vote would make a difference. And a lot of times it's going to be local elections, because at the national level there is a challenge. Indiana, generally speaking, doesn't have a huge voice when it comes to the presidential election, because we're a smaller state. We don't have the electoral votes that are necessary. The primary comes later in the process, so we don't, usually the decisions are made on the candidates by the time it gets around to us having our voice. So, and because that's what people tend to associate with politics, it all gets lost. When you can help people connect the dots between what happens at the state level and the local level and what their interests are, that's when you can start actually making a difference. Because otherwise, as long as people keep associating everything with the national politics, it's easy to make excuses for being disenfranchised, because at that level, we aren't necessarily as influential as other states, unfortunately.
It was interesting that you said that you had spent time in the D.C. area, because right here in Fort Wayne right now, again, like I've been saying time and time again, we have sent scouts, so to speak, all over the entire universe to bring ideas into Fort Wayne that we can incorporate to somehow create a better identity or attract more businesses to Fort Wayne by copying other people's examples. Now, in the Washington, D.C. area, in Virginia, in that area, there's not a battleground areas there that they market. And, battleground areas are where people get killed.
Right.
And they've turned catastrophes into marketing opportunities. And I guess they're doing quite well because they're still open.
Right.
Whereas here in Fort Wayne, we don't even think about doing that. I mean, we have the number 3 battleground between Indians and Americans over here in Lakeside area. I mean, that ranks right behind Custer's Last Stand in terms of killing Americans.
Right.
I'm not promoting killing Americans, but my point is that we have historic landmarks around here that nobody ever thinks to even talk about. As a matter of fact, we even ignore history. Right. But they don't do it there. Can you elaborate on that a little bit?
I think it's challenging because, like I said before, I grew up outside of Philadelphia, which, of course, we've got history surrounds that place, right? We've got Independence Mall, you've got the Liberty Bell, you've got Valley Forge, Washington's Crossing. There's a lot of history there. Washington, D.C., Virginia, like you said, I think the challenge that you have with all of that is that some history is more popular than others. And I think the challenge that we have is that...
we here in Fort Wayne.
Yeah, we here in Fort Wayne. I think the challenge we have in this area is that our wars, our conflicts, our, whatever you want to call them, haven't necessarily captured the public imagination as vividly as the American Revolution or the Civil War has. And as a result, you don't necessarily have, it's harder to market ourselves and market those historic landmarks we have because they don't have the same connection to the public consciousness. You look at the impact Saving Private Ryan had, to use a semi-recent example, of awareness of World War II veterans and how much that we had a National D-Day Museum that just kind of sprung up overnight because all of a sudden there's this piece of popular culture that everybody can interface with and everybody can learn about, and so as a result they want to do something about it and they want to be more a part of that and remembering that. And I mean everybody went overseas, they built a museum down in New Orleans, but it's the same kind of thing. I think that if you were to have some way to popularize the history around our area and popularize the story that is told by our area landmarks, then maybe you would start seeing that kind of tourism because there'd be something there. But it's also, you can't necessarily, I think if you talk to the tourism professionals, they'd also tell you they're also near major airports. They also have good, there's a lot of other facilities that promote tourism to make it easier for people to interact with those. And so, locally, we go with what our strong suit is. And lately, I think our strong suit's been in the area of, youth sports and sports competitions and things like that. Seems to be where their focus is. Now, the next step would be, okay, well, they've got breaks between their games or their matches, or depending on whatever sport they're playing. How can we help them appreciate some of these other landmarks that we have to get them to come back?
You just gave the answer.
Yeah.
In these athletic contests, those are metaphors for war.
Right.
One team kills the other. And plus, I read that the American Revolution didn't really end until Anthony Wayne solved the problem here at the rivers.
Well, that's true.
There's so many ways that's where those creative writers come into play here to tell a story that hadn't been sold correctly. And from what I've noticed here around Fort Wayne, they have blinders on. They'd rather make things up. I mean, that's a personal opinion. But as you're winding down here, let me ask you this. What do you? We covered a lot here. I just wanted to know about you and your philosophical makeup, because you have a lot of good information here. What is it about you that people need to know as to why you make a good candidate for the city clerk position?
Well, I think I make a good candidate for the position because I'm really passionate about what it is the clerk does. It's not, it's a unique blend of responsibilities between serving the public, serving the council, helping the public connect with their government, and enforcing parking, which is kind of a random element of the job that's thrown in there. And I think that, you know, between my background working in Congress and having experience with legislative process and my passion for serving people and being involved, and you know, I have strong political positions that I'm not afraid to share on all sorts of things. But in 10 years in working for a local congressional office, I worked with people of all sorts of political persuasions. And that doesn't stop me from working with people or serving them, because there's still folks that are connected to our office. There are people that don't have another voice other than our office. And when you're working in government, it's your job to help them out as much as you can, as long as it's with whatever fits within the purview of your office. So I am passionate about politics, and I have my passionate personal views, but I'm also passionate about serving people. And that's why I want this position. So I think that I'd have the best opportunity to serve the people, the most people, in the most effective way.
Derek, thank you very much.
No problem. Thank you for having me.
And thank you for watching.